Welcome explorers. Today, dive into the thrilling TTP narration of Hunting with Predators by Banancake, a 25-part fan-made saga from the Nature of Predators series by Spacepaladin15 on r/HFY.
Memory transcription subject, Vikri, Venlil volunteer crewman of UNS Cardinal. Date, standardized human time, October 29, 2136, 12 days after the Battle of Earth. Sigra was an emotional wreck. She peeked out between her paws as she lay in front of Tenga, who was waving the nutrient bar in her direction. Tears stained her face as she stared up at the predator. 1 second the human would kick up the panic flowing in her blood all over again, the next, he would do something that, in her mind, didn't compute. It was exhausting her. Disappointed, Tenga sat down near the Gojid for a few minutes, allowing her to catch her breath before he spoke again. Sigra, we're gonna have to trust each other at some point. Face it. Without us, you're food. With us, you're a prisoner. Prisoner sounds a lot better to me. Tenga looked down at the Gojid with sympathy in his eyes. Sigra tensed at the sound of his voice. Food sounds like the reality either way. Reese walked up to the pair holding a cardboard plate. Already got that covered. He passed the plate to Tenga. Thanks, Reese. Tenga drew his knife and wiped the blade along his sleeve. Reese nodded. I'll, leave you two alone then. He sauntered over to where I stood and leaned against the rock beside me, watching the scene curiously. Tenga cut at the flesh with his knife while Sigra looked on in horror. The Gojid backed away closer to the ledge. You're mocking me, she strained. Tenga began chewing on a piece of the bison. Not at all. I'm just hungry. Are you? He held out the ration once again. The Gojid said nothing and watched in disgust as the human's teeth tore at the flesh. Tenga tilted his head down. I'd rather not spend the rest of our time out here dragging you around with a rope. All I want is for you to prove to me that you can cooperate. Take the food. Sigra stared at the paper-wrapped plant matter for a few seconds. Then, for the first time, she looked at Tenga squarely in the eyes. Her body reacted immediately. The spines on her back bristled, and her pupils expanded. The humans called the eyes a window into the soul. The longer I studied human expression, the more I learned that human eyes responded to almost every emotion a person could experience. Their eyes could find anything but hide nothing. Tenga had nothing to hide. After a moment, Sigra's reaction died down as she once again eyed the ration. She breathed deeply as she shuffled to her knees. With a trembling paw, she reached out. Her eyes shut tight as she grabbed onto the food just inches away from Tenga's massive hand. Her eyes opened as she panted slightly. There was a smirk on the lieutenant's face. He let go of the ration and sat back while Sigra held that position for a moment. She shakily returned her paw to her chest as she clutched the wrapper. Tenga chuckled. It's sad, but that act alone makes you far braver than the people that sent you here to kill us. Sigra sat back down, trying to slow her breathing. What's going to happen to me after this? She choked. Tenga thought for a moment. To be honest, I'm not sure. We have a judicial system, so you'll have a chance to defend yourself. You'll probably be tried and sentenced based on your role in a genocide. The public is going to be furious. They'll push for the most severe sentence available for anyone involved in this. Sigra exhaled. Vapor clouded around her face. Death. Tenga bit at the inside of his lip as he nodded. Maybe. A gust of wind howled across the cliffside, and the trees below us rustled softly. The sizzling from the fire stopped as Grant took the final strip of flesh from the pan. In its place, the steady roar and crackling of the flames filled the air. Tenga sighed. That's why it's so important for you to cooperate with us, Sigra. You help me, and I'll do whatever I can to help you. It's your best shot. So the lieutenant rested his forearms on his legs as he weaved his fingers together. He leaned toward Sigra slightly. Where were you and your group going? Where was that device leading you? Sigra took a shaky breath as she put her paws on her head. For a moment, she said nothing. She looked to the mountains. The silent observers looming on the horizon. I don't want them to die. Tenga nodded. And I respect that. But one way or another, they're gonna be found. The odds of this ending peacefully would be much better if we had you to talk them down from fighting. So they can be executed. They'd stand a much better chance in a court than dodging bombs. Tenga squinted at the Gojid. You didn't even consider that you wouldn't be able to talk them down. Sigra turned back toward the human. What? So that's 2 lies you've told me, Ms. Nobody. Tenga took another bite of the steak. Sigra was stunned. Her jaw clenched as her gaze hit the ground. Tenga chuckled. We can worry about that later. He set the empty plate beside him. It's unlikely anyone will be coming back for you. If you want those soldiers to have a chance at living, help me convince them to surrender. Please. A moment of silence passed. I could see tears escaping Sigra's closed eyes. It was a difficult decision to make. With the Arxer, surrender meant you were a free kill, or you were free cattle. I had no doubt that those were possibilities running through her mind. However, I don't think Tenga's fairness was lost on her. That alone set humans apart in a big way. The fact that she wasn't on a spit or being beaten to near death was a massive improvement over what she was expecting. Eventually, Sigra spoke in a quiet, shaky voice. We were following a transponder to the north. She looked back up at Tenga. Her spines bristled in response. One from a Federation ship. That's all I know. There might be no one there, probably just a wreck, but we decided that if there were other survivors, that's where they'd be. Tenga nodded. Okay, he whispered. He stood up. He began to turn around before he looked over his shoulder. Did you believe in your mission? Sigra wiped her face and took a moment before answering. I heard rumors. Rumors about the cradle. I heard the humans fought the Arxer when they arrived. That they saved many of our people. At the time, I dismissed it as just rumors, but... She breathed deeply as she looked at the ground. I don't know what's worse. Part of me hopes that you'll torture me, eat me. At least then, I'll know I was right, and I didn't take part in this for nothing. Tenga said nothing. He nodded slowly as he looked down at Sigra. I'll leave the ropes off, but you're not to leave my side, understood? The Gojid's ears flicked affirmatively. After tearing down the camp, we continued along the cliff face toward the west. Sigra walked just ahead of me, staying just behind Tenga. I was careful to keep a safe distance from her spines. Anything might set them off, and I'd be full of holes if I was too close. The terrain slowly got more perilous. The ledge became narrow as the steep ridge on our left got closer and closer, threatening to push us over the edge. The rocky cliff was wide enough to walk over without getting too close to the drop, but it left little room for movement. To my right, I could see the very tops of the evergreens just below us. At least we were getting lower. Querek decided to walk on his own for a while, huddling in the blanket behind me. Reese, as usual, was on scratch duty, periodically catching the Venlol's paw anytime he saw his claws come out. Strangely, Querek hadn't complained much about his arm since we made the climb. I hoped that was a sign that it was finally healing. Behind me, Reese turned back toward Grant, who gazed over the ledge at the forest below. So, what rank do you think she is? Reese asked, tilting his head toward the nervous Gojid. Grant thought for a second. Nothing too important. Maybe just some officer. I'm willing to bet on Lieutenant, Reese smirked. Grant chuckled. All right, you're on. I heard a meaty smack as the two shook hands. From above us, a crackling sound surged through the upper atmosphere. I instantly recognized it as more orbital debris. It seemed everyone else did too. No one paid any particular mind to it aside from an occasional glance at the sky. Suddenly, a deep rumbling sound emanated from the other side of the hill. Everyone froze as we looked to the sky. Suddenly, just over our heads, a burning wreck ripped through the air. In its wake, an immense pressure wave threatened to blow us off the cliff. I pinned my ears to the side of my head as the sound assaulted my senses. I braced against the hillside and watched the fireball land less than a mile away to our right. A massive explosion ensued, ejecting chunks of terrain and metal into the air as a cloud of fire erupted from the crash site. "Everyone down!" Tenga shouted as we braced for the rapidly approaching shockwave, clearly outlined by the wave-like pattern it made as it bent the tall evergreens. Querek staggered behind me as we held our ears tight. The sun was blotted out as Reese crouched in front of us, shielding us with his body. The shock wave crashed into the cliff. I felt it surge into my chest as it pressed me against the snowy hillside. I felt the air in my lungs get squeezed out. The ground below me seemed to turn to liquid for a brief moment as I felt the shockwave pass beneath my feet. It was over in an instant. I could hear smaller debris raining down around us as Reese huddled over Querek and me. After a few seconds, everything went quiet. I could only hear the ringing in my own ears. Reese sat up from over top of me, and I could see the forest blazing in the distance. Had it been the drive section of a ship, it would have vaporized us. I gasped to catch my breath as I checked to ensure everyone was all right. Grant lifted his head from the prone position, unlacing his fingers from the back of his scalp. I heard Reese curse as he pulled a large wooden splinter from his forearm. Tenga rubbed at his ears as he checked on Sigra, who staggered to her feet panting. Before we could finish catching our breath, a new sound pushed away the eerie silence. It sounded like distant thunder, but it wasn't coming from the sky. I turned around to see the trees on the hillside being bent toward us by some unseen force. I turned to the lieutenant, "Tenga. The ridge." We all looked toward the hillside to see a wall of white rapidly approaching. The thunderous sound became louder and louder. "Hang on!" Reese shouted beside me, struggling to yell over the sound of thousands of tons of snow barreling down the ridge toward us. Panic shot through me as I looked for something, anything to grab onto before the tidal wave of ice arrived. All I could do was brace, holding against the rocky ledge with my claws. All at once, everything went white. My hearing was utterly drowned out as I drew one last icy breath. The avalanche slammed into me, removing my paws from the ledge with ease. The ground beneath me vanished as I flailed in the flowing flurry. Terra's gravity took me in its grasp, and I began falling as I cried out. A dark shape appeared in Maelstrom shortly after. The wind was knocked out of me as I slammed into it. Instinctively, I dug my claws into the object as deep as possible, wrapping my arms and legs around it. My claws found traction as I felt the familiar texture of a tree scraping away at my paws as my descent slowed. Finally, I stopped sliding down. I felt the freezing torrent continue washing over my back as I held on for dear life, shutting my eyes tight. The avalanche felt like it lasted an eternity. The deafening noise finally faded away as the sun once again reached my eyes. I was just a few feet off the ground. I let go and fell back first into the snow as I struggled to breathe. Every breath felt like fire in my chest. I shielded my eyes as, above me, Querek dangled from the cliff edge, grasping to the ledge with his healthy arm while the other hung uselessly beneath him. Chunks of snow were still falling over the rocks above him. I saw Grant reach over. "Grab on." Querek let out a growling grunt as he swung his other arm up toward the human. Grant caught his paw. "Come on. Grab on." "I am." Querek shouted back. Grant looked down at him for a second before grabbing onto his forearm with his other hand. He pulled the Venlil back onto solid ground before I saw his face appear back over the edge. "Vic! You good?" he shouted down at me. I rolled over as I groaned in pain. "Yeah," I said weakly, trying to force out enough air to shout back. Tenga's face appeared over the ledge as powder rained down the cliff. "Where's Reese?" "He's not up there." "No." "Find him, quick." Tenga barked. As the humans began yelling out Reese's name, I staggered to my feet and stumbled around through the snow. I was disoriented. My head ached as the ringing in my ears seemed to bounce around in my skull. I tried to call out the predator's name but couldn't force out enough air to get more than a raspy squeal. After walking a few meters, I saw the human's arms sticking out of the snow, waving around desperately. I hurried over and started frantically digging as I squeaked out his name. Reese! I started shoveling powder away from where I thought his face was. Every movement of my shoulders ached in my ribs. I grunted as I caught my breath through my teeth. Finally, I saw the predator's pink skin peeking through the snow. Reese! I cleared the remaining snow away from his face. Reese gasped for air as his arm finally stopped flailing. I leaned in closer. Are you all right? Yeah. He panted. Yeah, I think so, just a bit stuck. His face squinted as he strained against the hundreds of pounds of powder entombing the rest of his body to no effect. I looked back toward the cliff overshadowing us. I found him. He's buried in the snow, but he's all right. I wheezed. Okay. Stay where you are. We're coming down. Tenga called out. Reese panted as he looked up at me. You don't sound so good. I'll be okay, I think I just cracked a rib. I held the right side of my ribcage. Nothing seemed out of place. I took a moment to inspect my limbs as well. My paws were covered in scratch marks from sliding down the tree. I would have preferred to land in the snow if it didn't mean suffocating. Through the ringing in my ears, I heard something. Another new sound, which was starting to become a bad omen. It sounded like grunting and groaning, but not from any creature I was familiar with. It was guttural and raspy. Deeper in the forest, I saw a snow spray get kicked into the air. Emerging from it was a giant quadrupedal creature with a thick, brown coat spotted with velvety bloodstains. I could hear it sniff the air in short, sporadic breaths as mist escaped its nose. I felt a rush in my head as my vision expanded. Hide, Reese whispered behind me. I turned toward the cliff face. In the bottom was a small rock overhang that I could squeeze into, not far from Reese. I quietly hurried over to it and crawled in on my stomach, clenching my teeth as pain surged through my chest. I turned onto my side to look out toward the creature. It turned toward Reese as it slowly approached, still gathering his scent in sharp, loud breaths as it plodded forward. I looked toward Reese. He was totally defenseless. As the creature approached closer, I knew it was the grizzly. Its profile matched the shape I'd seen stalking through the forest perfectly. On its paws were long, sharp claws that I knew could rend a crocodile apart easily. Its mouth hung open slightly, revealing a row of razor-sharp teeth that sent chills up my spine. Two small, brown eyes locked on to where Reese was trapped. The closer it got, the faster I breathed, and the more pain raked through my lungs. The bear made pained panting and grunting sounds as vapor escaped its open mouth. It was easy to see why. The massive predator was covered in wounds. Many of them were in areas I would think their vitals would be. I shuddered to imagine shooting this thing repeatedly and realizing it wasn't stopping. From above me, the humans began shouting and barking at the creature. Hey, bear, they called down, making a wild array of noises. The bear acknowledged their presence and hesitated for a moment but continued stalking toward Reese. From above me, I could hear Tenga's voice echo through the hole I cowered in. Get me a fucking rope.